Well, good evening. I hereby call to order the special meeting of the Planning Commission on August 31st of 2022. And thank you all for coming, and I suspect you'll be more than happy to share your views with us. I want to thank you for that up front. Let's go to confirmation and roll call.
Chairman, this meeting has been posted in accordance with the Nevada Open Meeting Law. All members are present and you do have a quorum.
Thank you. Let's continue on with the Pledge of Allegiance. Would everyone please stand and join me? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So this is a special meeting, and as such, it has one agenda item, and that agenda item is a public hearing. On our agenda right now, however, we also have a open public comment period. What I'd like to do, though, is kind of encourage folks to hold for just a few minutes until we get to the public comment period of the agenda item. And it would provide everyone the opportunity to hear what staff has to say, hear some background. And so if you aren't needed elsewhere, I encourage you to hold for just a few minutes. However, recognize that some folks may have other places to go. If anyone has comments and that they would like to share at this time, please step forward to the dais, state your name and your address for the record.
Thank you, Chairman Matuskas, members of the Commission. My name is Kieran McManus. This is hopefully a culmination of things that have been ongoing for several years now. The purpose of my comments is the one item on your agenda, which is the Historic Preservation Ordinance. When I look at something like this and look at the process that we've been through now for a number of years on this, I believe it's been very carefully done. I would thank Mr. Mays, our Community Development Director, for the work he's done. There have been numerous public meetings held, town halls, surveys, going back, as I said, a few years. These have been done in a manner to elicit opinions and suggestions from residents of the city. Those have come back favorable to having a historic preservation ordinance unwaveringly. There has been no doubt that residents, especially those within the district, support doing this. But even the residents of the city at large have supported this in the surveys that have been conducted. As this is something for consideration by the Planning Commission, I would ask that the Planning Commission do what Planning Commissions are expected to do and not waver off into political considerations of, do we do this, do we not do this? The task I believe that the Commission has is to look at this as a zoning classification, which is what it is. We have a number of zoning classifications that apply in Boulder City, and this is one that is being presented as a way to preserve the architecture of existing homes and businesses in an area that has already been designated as a historic district. Matter of fact, that designation goes back 40 years. But what was not done, or was attempted and actually was passed at one point, was a preservation ordinance. That commission never had any members appointed to it and was later repealed and replaced with an ordinance that does not provide protection for the architecture of homes and buildings and businesses here in Boulder City. This ordinance is based on a model ordinance that was presented by the Nevada State Historic Preservation Office. It is not something that was made up. It was done through the Nevada State Historic Preservation Office. There was a committee that was formed at the direction of the City Council. There were some modifications, I believe very minor, that were made to that model ordinance. And again, this is a recommendation then not just made up here in Boulder City, but actually developed by a group of professionals who work for the state. In the past, I know I've attended a meeting where Commissioner Nate Lassoff presented some false information about what these types of ordinances are proposed to do. He made a statement that this type of ordinance would prevent people from changing the knobs on kitchen cabinets. That's simply not the case. That, in my view, is a scare tactic and certainly not the intent of this ordinance. This ordinance applies to the exterior architecture that faces a public street for those homes that are designated. It has also been determined that it would not apply to homes or businesses that are no longer considered conforming or contributing to the historic district. Unfortunately, we've dropped below 50% in a recent survey that was conducted, again, at the direction of City Council. We simply can't afford to keep losing these and call ourselves historic. That's the gist of what's happening here, the need for this type of ordinance. When people say, well, you know, is this the right thing or this is unusual, the City of Las Vegas has at least a dozen historic districts within the city limits of Las Vegas. They have an ordinance. In a city that prides itself on blowing things up, they have found a need and a desire to have preservation of certain neighborhoods in that city based on the architecture that's still there and that the people in those areas, again, support. I would ask that this body does what it's supposed to do and take a look at the fact that this is simply a zoning classification. It is not a tug of war on politics for the commission to consider. It is simply a zoning classification, and it is intended to preserve what people love about this city. I would ask for your support on making a positive recommendation to the City Council. Thank you.
Thank you.
If everyone could please sign in when they speak at the podium, we would appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. Would anyone else like to be heard at this moment?
Sure. Hi, my name is Brent Lamb. I live at 636 Avenue C, and I'm in one of the contributing properties. Commenting on the prior speaker, yes, I think it would be, I support the ordinance as a concept, but as we all know, the devil can be in the details. So I read it and I had a few comments. You know, a lot of positive comments, but I'll stick to the things that I disagree with, so we're not here all night. Page 2, purpose, there's a item C that says that one of the purposes is to ensure harmonious, orderly, and efficient growth and development of the city. I don't think codifying growth in an ordinance for preservation this is not the place for a purpose like that. So I'd like to see that eliminated. Similarly, item D in purpose, promoting economic prosperity and welfare of the community. I don't think this ordinance is the place for those kinds of comments or positions. Lots of arguments about what the role of a city is in promoting prosperity, and I don't think we should be getting into that in this ordinance. Page 4, most of the rest of my comments are directed at the commission itself and how it functions and what its powers are. in general, I just want to comment that I think it's beneficial. So the power to stop a homeowner or a property owner from making changes to his or her property is a very significant power. And so it should be treated very judiciously, and all of my comments about, for the rest of this are in that sort of vein. Top of page 4, qualification standards for the, what are they called? The Historic Preservation Officer. I believe that the SQI PQS qualification was developed by the Department of Interior is the appropriate one. I don't think there should be ORs. So for example, I don't think a landscape architect or architecture qualification is adequate for a commissioner with these kinds of powers. Down at the bottom of page 4, procedures for historic property recommendations, designation A. It says the city council may designate historic properties. Again, I believe it's the commission. The commission should have the authority to make those designations. If the subject property owner wants to appeal, they have a right to appeal to the council. But I think the authority to make that decision initially should rest with the commission, trying to get the commission out of being an advisor to the city and actually a standalone body with expertise that's looking at properties and applying their knowledge and expertise, free from politics. Again, item B, for procedures, public hearings, the commission should conduct the public hearings. Item C, there are recommendations of the commission and the process for how these recommendations are made. Item 2 in C says that the decision to consider a request for designation as historic property shall be approved or denied by a majority of the commission present. Well, that last word is a problem. There are lots of commissions that don't have full representation when decisions are made. Again, this is a very powerful commission if it comes into existence. I believe that a majority of the commissioners should be present for any decision made about designation. Page 5.
Mr. Lamb?
Yes.
During public comment, each speaker has up to 5 minutes.
Am I out?
And you're out just now in a second, but if you had like one summary comment, I'd certainly be happy to allow that. And maybe for the benefit of the audience, maybe I'll hold my fingers up when you get to 4 minutes to give you an opportunity to, but if you had some kind of a conclusion.
No, just one more specific.
Okay.
Any amendments to designation should be made by the commission, not the city council. Again, keep the politics out. And thank you very much. And I appreciate the work you guys do.
Well, thank you very much. All right, let's move to folks that might. Yes, absolutely.
Hi, my name's Grant Turner. I'm a lifelong resident of Boulder City and a longtime member of the Historic District. Generally speaking, I'm a major proponent of historic preservation. I've worked on tens of historic properties. I'm intimately familiar, and generally speaking, I support the concept. I do believe this presents some issues. Number one, blanket statement, any proposed changes to the historic district that restrict the rights of private property owners, either without their consent or despite their objections, to me seems just un-American. If if to the extent that there are people in the historic district that want to make changes to their primary residence or to their private property, and they are unable to do so, and it's being done without their consent, that to me is the primary issue here. Rights, limiting our rights, it discriminates against private members of the historic district. Relative to members at large, it makes the approval process more burdensome, which already in this town, getting anything through the process is a challenge. We recently spent almost 8 months receiving one permit to relocate electrical at 524 Nevada Way. So to further complicate the process by additional approvals, I think we need to fix the problem that we have before we add in additional variables. Property values. One of the common problems with the historic property is a lot of them have one bathroom. So the primary change I find is people adding a second bathroom, whether it's an addition or a conversion. And in one instance, and a lot of the times what you'll see is the sort of sleeping, I think it's called a sleeping porch off to the right side of the house. They add on to the back of that, which requires changing the roof line. In a lot of cases where it was previously siding, they'll stucco. That's a very common change. In an instance where maybe you've outgrown your house, maybe you bought the house. Imagine a married couple that buys a house, starts a family, wants to then add a bathroom, and is unable to do so. That deed restriction was not on their property when they purchased the house. They save their money. They pay for an architect. They pay for an engineer. They get all the way down to the process, and they're told, no, you cannot add a second bathroom onto your house. What are their options at that point? They either continue to live in a house that doesn't fit their needs, or they have to sell their house and move to a different area, maybe outside the historic district. That's a decision that a private property owner should not have to face, especially considering that restriction was not there when they bought their house. But in terms of property values, if the historic district is known as small houses with limited to one bathroom in many cases, that severely limits the pool of buyers. If you own a house and you're now forced to sell it, your property values will be affected because of that. It also will dissuade people from buying in the historic district if they know, oh, you know what, I wanted to live there, but I would need a second bathroom, or I would need to make any alteration to my house. Too much of a hassle, I'm not gonna do it. You've then created a situation where the historic district is less valuable. Prevents future development. Under the proposed guidelines, I believe Forge Social House would not have been allowed to have been built. It was a historic structure. It required massive changes. It required a huge addition. And in the end, it's a beautiful building. It provides jobs. It increased the tax base. Countless people have had special memories there. And there again, to be $50,000 into plans and engineers and everything, and then to be told, no, you cannot build that. You cannot go hire people to work in there. You cannot add to the community. These are all situations that I think we need to avoid. And I would say, finally, any situation that creates a system where individuals within the governing body have power over people against whom they may have a personal or political bias, which, seems unlikely at the local level, but unfortunately, we've seen precedent for it recently when applicants applied for a historic RDA grant. They met every criteria. They received 2 recommendations from historic preservation. They complied with every request made by them, by the body. And without justification at the end, they were denied that grant and given no explanation to why. So unfortunately, there is precedent to have to consider personal or political bias in the process. So giving that body teeth, to me, opens the city up to tremendous liability going forward. And I'll wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. What I'd like to do now is.
My name's Michael Delormier, and my name is Michael Delormier. I'll sign in. We live in the avenues in a workers, dam workers' house in the historic district, and I'm against this because I'm against adding steps to have to make changes to my house. The things that concern me about the ordinance the most are there seem to be harsh penalties. There's misdemeanor per day, $500 fine per day per item. So that's the sort of thing that scares me from making any changes, even important changes. I'm quite worried about that say, fixing a window or replacing a window, maybe to upgrade it to be more energy efficient will be very difficult or expensive now. I think historic looking windows are very expensive. And another thing that worries me is sort of if someone's struggling, they may get stuck with large fines and a very difficult process to make progress to fix their house. I imagine that, like it could happen that you just need to fix real problems more than aesthetics, and you get blocked. In my experience in the past, we were blocked from doing like important structural repairs to our house for due to just too much red tape. That wasn't here, that was in San Francisco. And there's quite a lot there, but I mean, these penalties seem even worse than there. So that's why I'd be against this. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move it to the folks that are online, but one last comment from in here for right now, and then Holly, if you could put the number on the board once she's done speaking, I'd appreciate it.
Thanks, and I'll try to be quick. My name's Bryn Delormier. I live at 660 Avenue F. We moved in summer of last year, and I'm sorry, I don't see a lot of my neighbors here. We just tried to make them all aware. They were not aware of this ordinance. We just became aware of it in June of this year. So it was concerning to us having read it, and then even more concerning realizing how few of our neighbors were aware. So I don't want to speak for all their reasons, but they're concerned about it. And I want to note that since we've made it aware on social media and knocking door to door of every neighbor that I've had time to do so, I didn't have time to to complete some cohesive notes here. So just a few things that I've noticed from reaching out and looking at other groups, reading the ordinance, reading all the information that these groups have put together. And I want to acknowledge James Howard Adams, who spent 2 hours meeting with us on Saturday, hearing out our every concern. So thank you, and thank you for Michael Mays for all the effort that he's put into giving us information about the grant program. And Charlie Hantz from the Historic Preservation Committee for giving us info, looking at our house and saying this detail, that detail. We've learned a lot about the architecture of this era. And we're new here, so we're actually in the process of adapting our home to meet our standards, and we want to participate in, I like old houses, I like renovating them, I want to do something like this. Having learned about the ordinance, having read through it, it threw up a ton of red flags for me, which make me question, do I even want to make my house, which has since been rated non-contributing, do I want to put it on that contributing list, given I'll now be subject to a lot of standards that I'm not currently subject to? So it's a major concern for me. And there are different opposing groups. Our houses got flyered on this block by the History and Arts Foundation. And in their wording, it states getting from a 43% contributing rate to a 51%, which in the ordinance, there are no tangible metrics to do so. So I didn't get a chance to reach out to them yet. Like I said, this has all been outreach we've done in the last week to 10 days. But a suggestion I wanted to make to them was, there's been so much turnover in just the time since they hired the Northwind consultants, and since walking the blocks, I've looked at their survey, and there are a lot of houses just on the brink. Ours is probably one of them. I think that's been stated, and they told us what would need to be done to get to contributing. So a suggestion I wanted to make, other than putting a pretty scary ordinance in place, is maybe backing off from that. And to the mayor's point, he said in the May city council meeting, this has been picked up by every iteration of government. A consultant's been hired. Surely a lot of money, time and effort has been put into that, just to have it shot down and archived and brought up by the next iteration of government. So, and I've read a lot of those previous ordinances. That has to be frustrating for everybody, and I'm sure it's going to be frustrating for me to make the same argument in a couple of years when I want to renovate our house. So I read the 1998 ordinance just before coming down here. So I don't want to throw the whole thing away. I'd rather come to some tangible metrics that work for everybody, realizing that some of my neighbors have no interest in historic preservation. They've lived in their house for half a century before the National Register, before we were put on it. We do have an interest. I'm slowly getting bids now. Just before we came down here, we found it's going to be $20,400 just to do our facade windows in a historically accurate way. And that's after taking the suggestions from the Northwind consultant, which I did like, and getting a quote for them. So that's hopefully something they'll consider. And another is, we had just received some comments on Nextdoor from somebody who had said, well, we don't want people painting their houses purple and gold, and I'll wrap it up. But we don't want their houses being painted purple and gold, and we don't want hoarders. And I didn't have a chance to comment, but this isn't about policing the neighborhood, which is what I've been told by everybody. It's about historic preservation, and you can paint over that. People can clean up a yard, but it's not to police those. It's to preserve what are stated in the history books as temporary tract housing in the first place when it was built in 1931. So by nature, some of the improvements we've made to our houses are the reason they're still standing 91 years later. So hope that's all taken, and I do appreciate everyone's efforts, but that's one of my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you. Holly, could you put the, so again, this is an initial public comment period, and if there are folks on, that are streaming this meeting that feel they'd like to make comments right now, please call into the number 702-589-9629. Otherwise, we'll move it over to staff and allow them to provide a little additional background. But if you have a desire to speak right now, please call in. And there is a delay, so we'll wait about 30 seconds. Can I hit that? No. Can I hit the 30
Yes, good afternoon. For the record, Fred Volz. The considerable public comment on social media sites Nextdoor Boulder City and Boulder City Social indicates many conflicting opinions about the proposed historic preservation ordinance before this commission today. It has been 4 years in the works with ample opportunities for public and staff input. What's important to remember is what makes Boulder City unique and what drives our local economy. Tourists, whether they come from the Las Vegas Valley or other parts of the world, spend time in Boulder City because it is different from the communities where they ordinarily live and work. The Great Depression of the 1930s meant few buildings or communities were constructed anywhere. For a planned community such as Boulder City to be built during that hardship decade, thanks to the deep pockets of federal taxpayers, represents a unique experience that cannot be duplicated anywhere else in Nevada or other places. Our community needs to preserve this extraordinary draw for visitors and residents, which supports our tax base and businesses. Most Boulderites do not live in the historic district, where real estate commands an enormous premium for buildings that were quickly built and which need considerable upkeep and updating. It is an expensive and laborious proposition for property owners to make their buildings functional while honoring the architecture due to scarce resource options for maintaining the street-facing facades. Many in the public believe the city's community development department has been an obstacle toward making needed updates and repairs to historic and non-historic buildings citywide. Securing and receiving final approval of a building permit can take many months. This process is something that the city manager and community development director need to improve upon for residents and business owners, because something as simple as a water heater replacement can be a needlessly protracted nightmare. Despite the often lengthy approval and construction process, this commission would serve the best long-range interests of Boulder City in approving the proposed ordinance. The proposed ordinance contains many safeguards to prevent imperious and arbitrary decisions by government officials. The time for action, not more delays and obstructions, has arrived. True leaders understand the importance of having a clear roadmap for our historic buildings so we don't end up destroying gems such as the former hospital, which has been a vacant lot for the last 7 years. The former hospital could have been repurposed as limited income housing for our large senior population if it lacked functionality as a modern hospital or retreat. We need to prevent more travesties, such as the hospital demolition, with an enforceable historic preservation ordinance. So I would strongly support us getting started on this and moving forward as quickly as possible. If there are problems, we can adjust it. And I would ask that these comments be added to the record verbatim. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll give it another few seconds and see if there's another comment. Is there?
Several to read into the record.
Okay. So at this point, Deputy City Clerk will read into the record. Comments have been received via email and other mechanisms.
The first comment is from Joanne Tinker. Please keep our historic preservation commitments at the highest level possible. Boulder City is a jewel and should make our commitment to historic preservation one of our very highest priorities. I have lived in Nevada most of the time since 1967 and in Boulder City since 2000. We have a unique history and environment to protect. It is good for our economy as well as the right thing to do. Let's always stay clean, green, and historic Boulder City. Joanne and Larry Tinker. Francis Baby. I understand the desire for historic preservation, and I have tried to read through the proposed plan and have some questions and concerns. Number one, does the ordinance cover all structures in the historic district, government, commercial, and residential? Government buildings should be a given. However, commercial properties purchased with a clear title and with no intent to occupy a structure whose history augments the function should be exempt, as should the many residences that have been modified to the extent their original appearance is not obvious. 2, there are buildings that were constructed after the period considered historic. Are they exempt? It seems to me that being subjected to judgments, restrictions, and/or fees after the fact of good faith purchase is very close to ex post facto. Joe Cowell. I am Joe Cowell, and I own and reside in the house at 619 Avenue B. I have lived in Boulder City since 1968 and have lived in several different locations in the historic district. I am in favor of the Historic Preservation Ordinance. Carolyn Wagner. I want to go on record as being in support of the proposed ordinance for the historic preservation. We are fortunate to live in a historic town and should do all we can to preserve it. Valerie McNay. I support the proposed historic preservation ordinance and hope the planning commissioners will too. I read the comprehensive 17-page draft historic preservation ordinance and appreciate the 2 years of discussion and work by the Ad hoc Historic Preservation Committee, consisting of 2 Historic Preservation Committee members and 2 City Council members in the creation of this ordinance. I believe the city staff, City Council, and Historic Preservation Committee have been doing a good job of preserving historic structures in Boulder City, but clearly need to do better as historic resources have declined from 82% to 42%, which is below the minimum threshold required for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. I do not live in the historic district, but I know many Boulder Cityites who do, and most attend the Historic Preservation Day and informative activities, including the proposed changes in the ordinance from voluntary to mandatory and enforceable preservation features, which apply in a fair and sensible way to the front of properties. Most appeared supportive of the new proposed historic preservation ordinance. The 2 new historic preservation grant funds, including residential $100,000 with up to $10,000 per project, demonstrates the support the city has been doing to help with the historic preservation in Boulder City. Please support this proposed historic preservation ordinance. Alice Denning. I am opposed to the city ordinance that tells people how to keep their homes or risk fines. I do not see any merit in maintaining European building design in the middle of the desert at all. I certainly do not see any merit in forcing people to live in a museum at their own expense. We live in a climate that would benefit from Pueblo and Navajo architecture. That should be the history we preserve, not houses designed for European winters. Nicola Collins. I am writing to urge you to support the proposed historic preservation ordinance. I own a house in the historic district and have been saddened to see our historic town slowly disappear over the past 30 years. Our history is what makes our town unique. We have a story to tell the rest of the America about resilience and in face of adversity. Our historic district provides a tangible link to that story. Residents may worry about big government taking away their rights, but there are many benefits to being part of a historic district. Research from all over the country show that houses in historic districts appreciate at a greater value than the local market. It also protects your investment. Nobody can build a McMansion next door. Historic districts increase tourism and enhance the local economy. A 2009 report indicated that 78% of all U.S. leisure travelers are cultural and are heritage travelers who spend on average $994 on their most recent trips, compared to $611 spent by non-cultural and heritage travelers. In 1982, our historic district had a rate of 85% of contributing properties. That rate has now fallen to 43%. This ordinance is our last chance to turn this around, and thanks to the hard work and dedication of our Historic Preservation Committee, you will have a chance to make a difference. Thank you for your consideration. All right, Bill Graff. As I stated before, I cannot support this ordinance as long as there are plans to build high-density condos at the old hospital property. That is totally out of the character of the neighborhood. I see nothing has been built there. What is the status of that property? This is Linda Brown. I would like to state that my husband, Dennis Brown, myself, Linda Brown, and my daughters, Shauna Wiley and Kelly Beck, are in favor of the historic preservation ordinance being passed. Thank you. Thank you, board members of the Planning Commission, for allowing me to submit my remarks on agenda item number 1, Resolution 1221, Historic Preservation. I support the proposed amendment to Title 11 of the City Code. I would also like to thank the members of the Historic Preservation Committee, Graham, Davenport, Hans, Turner, and Fayen, and the Historic Preservation Ordinance Ad Hoc Committee, Davenport, Turner, Adams, Jorgensen, for all their hard work. Community Development Director Michael Mays and several members of city staff have also been involved in getting this proposed ordinance ready for further discussion. This has been in the works for several years. There has been community input, open houses, and many meetings explaining the ordinance. Every property in the historic district received notification of those open houses. At those meetings, committee members and staff were present to answer the public's questions regarding the proposed ordinance and discuss the next steps. The draft ordinance was submitted to the State Historic Preservation Office. In other words, this ordinance has been well reviewed by many different experienced individuals, has been discussed for several years, and is ready for your approval, as well as the approval later by the City Council. There will be some opposition, there always is. For example, I don't want anyone telling me what I can do on my property. I have a right to do what I want. If you do what you want and paint your house purple with 24 gold trim and add an addition that does not match the other houses in the area, or keep the property looking like a junkyard, do your rights supersede the rights of your neighbors or the entire neighborhood or town? Please vote to preserve the history of Boulder City. Judith Hoskins. Rebecca Haig. As a native of Boulder City Historic District, Boulder City registered voter and property owner, I am writing to urge the approval of the Historic Preservation Ordinance currently before the Commission. Boulder City is almost unique amongst towns in the western states, and certainly in Nevada, for the attractiveness and the character of its historic district. We inherited this gem thanks to the brilliance of our Interior Department planners who developed the town, and to the wisdom of the later Boulder City governments and residents who kept so much of it intact. Preserving this district is not just a question of respect for our cultural heritage, it is good business sense. Boulder City is a popular tourist destination and a preferred residential retirement location, in good part because it is so lovely, not just a wide spot on the road around a railroad junction or the like, as it is the case with other communities in this part of the country. I urge you to put the city's interests first and foremost in approving the ordinance before the Commission. Beth Aldworth Miller. I have reviewed the proposed amendment to the Historic Preservation Ordinance and have no objections. I too agree to the importance of preserving Boulder City's historical neighborhood. Janelle Sorensen. Hello, I am writing in support of the Historic Preservation Ordinance proposed by the Boulder City History and Arts Foundation. I am fortunate to own one of the dwindling numbers of contributing properties in the historic district. Historic buildings contribute greatly to the charm and uniqueness of Boulder City, enhancing the community for residents and visitors alike. If we are to keep from becoming just another suburb, we must make the effort to protect our historic buildings and preserve the uniqueness of the most charming small town in Nevada. Otherwise, I fear that we will soon just be an indistinguishable satellite community to Henderson. I live in Portland, Oregon for many years, and I am heartsick at what has happened there, as lack of protections has resulted in reckless demolition of historic buildings, which have been replaced with buildings wildly out of character with their surrounding neighborhoods. There is much community outcry about the situation, but once it has already happened, it is too late. I hope that we can protect the historic character of Boulder City before it's too late. In the words of Joni Mitchell, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got until it's gone. Let's not wait until the historic district is diminished even further before taking action to preserve it. I urge the Planning Commission to support the proposed historic preservation ordinance. Gloria Colston. I am not a proud owner of one of the buildings or homes in Boulder City that were created when this town was established. I wish I were. The history, ambiance, and community atmosphere is what brought my family to Boulder City back in the 70s and then again in my retirement. When driving through the original streets of Boulder City, I can only imagine the hard work and perseverance and sacrifice these residents made in building one of the top 7 man-made wonders still today in the USA. Establishing a preservation ordinance can only enhance and upgrade this community's place in history. We've lost some of the important buildings that could have been repurposed with guidelines to enhance the town's local residents as well as tourists because we don't have preservation guidelines. Let's not lose any further buildings. I vote in favor of the historic preservation ordinance. That's it, Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Chairman, we should give one more opportunity if anyone wants to make public comment that's in the audience, with a reminder that we are going to open up the public hearing later, and there is another opportunity there.
Right. So if anyone in the audience would like to be heard at this moment, please step forward, state your name, give us your address if you would for the record.
Thank you. My name is Charles Hantz. I'm a member of the Historic Preservation Committee, but these comments are mine alone and may not represent the views of the committee as a whole. The proposed Historic Preservation Ordinance references NRS 278 and NRS 384, but I believe it's worthwhile to be a little more specific as to what's contained in these statutes. I'm not going to read all the statutes. One is NRS 278-02076. This statute provides that a governing body may designate a historic neighborhood in a county or city for the purpose of promoting the educational, cultural, economic, and general welfare of the public through the preservation and protection of sites, buildings, structures, and areas of historic interest. Section 4 of this statute states, and I quote, "An ordinance under which a historic neighborhood is designed must, A, contain criteria which substantially achieve the preservation and protection of sites, buildings, and structures of historic significance in the historic neighborhood, and B, provide for a designated review board with the power to review proposed alterations to buildings and structures within the historic neighborhood." Another statute is NRS 278.250. This statute allows the governing body to divide the city into zoning districts, and within these districts it may, and I quote, "regulate and restrict the erection, construction, reconstruction, alteration, repair, or use of buildings, structures, or land," end quote. The zoning regulations must be adopted in accordance with the master plan for land use and as stated in subsection 2M of this statute, be designed to, quote, "ensure the protection of existing neighborhoods and communities, and in counties whose population is 700,000 or more, the protection of historic neighborhoods." Now, lastly, I'll mention NRS 384.005. This statute allows, and I'm quoting, "any city to establish a historic district. For the purpose of promoting the educational, cultural, economic, and general welfare of the public through the preservation, maintenance, and protection of structures, sites, and areas of historic interest and scenic beauty." Section 4 states, quote, "An ordinance establishing a historic district must, A, contain criteria which substantially achieve the preservation and rehabilitation of buildings of historic significance in the district, and B, provide for a designated review board with the power to review proposed alternatives to structures within the district." In closing, I would suggest that the current historic preservation ordinance falls far short of complying with many of the requirements mandated by these and other Nevada revised statutes. When the NRS uses language such as substantially achieve the preservation and protection of sites, buildings, and structures, or ensure the protection of historic neighborhoods, or contain criteria which substantially achieve the preservation and rehabilitation of buildings of historic significance, it seems to me that the state actually wants the city to preserve its historic buildings. In 1983, when the Boulder Historic District was established and listed on the National Register of Historic Places, 83% of the structures in the district were determined to contribute to the historic character of the district. When the district was re-inventoried in 2020, only 43% of the buildings in the district were considered contributing. I would maintain that a historic preservation ordinance, which allows the degradation of almost half of the contributing buildings in the historic district, does not comply with NRS statutes that require the substantial preservation and protection of the city's historic buildings. Therefore, I would encourage this commission to pass the proposed ordinance on to City Council with a recommendation to approve. And I would like to have this submitted verbatim to for the record. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, seeing no more comments at this point, we'll close this initial public comment period. Recognize that we will still have the comment period during the agenda item. And let's move on to the agenda item itself. So this is for possible action. Resolution number 1221, City of Boulder City. It's a public hearing and a recommendation to the City Council on a proposed amendment to Title 11 of the City Code to repeal Chapter 27, Historic Resources, and replace with a new Chapter 27, Historic Preservation. And Michael, would you please give the overview for the staff overview?
Good afternoon, Chairman Tuska, members of the Planning Commission, Michael Mays, your Community Development Director. So I have a short presentation I'd like to go through, highlighting the proposed ordinance. There are two areas that I want to cover in my presentation. First, a summary of how we got to this meeting tonight, and then to provide a brief overview of the proposed ordinance for your consideration. On the screen is the existing boundaries of the Historic Preservation Ordinance. I will talk in more detail about the existing ordinance and the regulations that are in place currently, and how this proposed modification would change those regulations. So, as part of the 2025 Boulder City Strategic Plan, one of the goals that was identified by the community and adopted by the City Council was to promote historic preservation efforts. Specifically, one of the action items contained within that goal was to evaluate the existing historic preservation ordinance and propose changes so that they are in line with the community's goals with respect to historic preservation. In October of 2020, the City Council approved Resolution 7167, which established the Boulder City Historic Preservation Ordinance Ad Hoc Committee that's been referenced earlier in the public comments. It represented 2 members of the Historic Preservation Committee and 2 members of the City Council. In January of 2021, the city contracted with Northwind Resources to update the surveys that had been conducted back in 1982 of every property within the historic district. That was the basis for the creation for the nomination to the National Register. There are approximately 517 properties, over 500. And with that 2021 survey update, Northwind had identified that only 43% of the properties contained within the historic district were still contributing to the district. And I'm going to explain that in more detail, what that means a little later in the presentation. That is compared to the original survey in '82, where 82% of the properties were contributing to the district. The ad hoc committee held 6 meetings between 2020 and 2022. In June of 2021, the ad hoc committee held 2 workshops. They were identified and invited all the property owners within the historic district, one being focused on businesses within the historic district, the other on residential properties. And at those workshops, it was an opportunity to present the proposed draft ordinance and answer questions. In August of 2021, the City Council adopted Resolution 7323, which adopted the Boulder City Historic Preservation Plan. This was also one of the action items in the strategic plan, that the city should adopt a historic preservation plan. The recommendations within that plan included very specific recommendations on modifications to the historic preservation ordinance, and the plan specifically referenced the SHPO model ordinance, which was the basis of the review of the ad hoc committee. In March of 2022, the ad hoc committee completed their work and provided a recommendation of a draft ordinance to the City Council. The ad hoc committee is suspended. Their role has been accomplished, and they have no further action. In May of 2022, City Council directed staff to begin the text amendment process. Anytime any proposed amendment to Title 11 of the City Code, which is also referred to as our zoning ordinance, is amended, it requires a public hearing before the Planning Commission and your review and recommendations onto the City Council. And that's the purpose for tonight's meeting. So I want to provide a summary of the proposed ordinance before you for your consideration. And before I talk about that, I want to talk about the existing ordinance. The existing ordinance, the most recent iteration was adopted in the mid-2000s, provides for the creation of historic districts. So there are provisions in there already that address that. It requires a 45-day delay for any demolitions within the historic district. It requires Historic Preservation Committee review of certain improvements to properties within the historic district, and the recommendations by the committee are advisory. So, in terms of proposed changes to that ordinance, commission and/or staff review would be determined based on whether the property is contributing or non-contributing to the historic district. Decision tree that's been provided in your packet is a proposed certificate of appropriateness approval matrix to address that. Now, it's important to point out that that is not codified with the ordinance before you, but what it is staff's proposed draft for consideration for the benefit of the Planning Commission to evaluate and certainly provide recommendations on, but it will require formal adoption by the City Council. And I'll describe it in greater detail in a second. With the proposed ordinance, decisions would be final by the proposed Historic Preservation Commission and/or staff unless appealed to the City Council. So there's the option to appeal any decision made by either staff or the commission to the City Council. This is the draft matrix that staff has prepared. And what staff has done, we use as a model the example that was contained in a historic preservation ordinance from another community, but try to tailor it to our community. So you can see the different types of actions in the left-hand column, anything from a proposed demolition to a modification to a structure within the historic district, and then a determination as to who would review that. You will see that we have separated contributing and non-contributing properties, with a majority of the decisions regarding the proposed improvements being made for contributing properties by the Historic Preservation Commission and decisions on non-contributing properties by staff. What's also an important consideration here is that with these decisions, it's following the Secretary of Interior standards. It's also a recognition that non-contributing properties do not have the same weight in its contributing status to the historic district, and so the regulations concerning non-contributing should be much more flexible, because it's the contributing properties that are still contributing to that historic district. And that would be reflected both in this proposed decision matrix and the design guidelines as modified for different historic structures, architectural standards of properties within the district. So, what is a contributing property? A contributing property is any structure that was built between 1930 and 1945. When the district was created, this was the period of significance, and that is what was established for the importance of the preservation of those structures and the creation of the district. Those properties today have not had very many modifications, and as a result still contribute to the architectural integrity of the properties built during that time period. So what are non-contributing properties? As you've already heard, a majority of the properties within the historic district are non-contributing. So any structure also built during that time period, 1930 to 1945, that has had so many modifications made to it that it no longer contributes to the district. Additions, roof modifications, those types of changes. It is no longer contributing to the district. A lot of examples of that are on the avenue streets. A lot of the properties on the avenue streets no longer contribute to the historic district. Any structure built after 1945, again, it was not built during the period of significance, so it can never contribute to the historic district. The only way that would be changed is if the community decided to create a new district or amended district for structures built during that time period. But they are non-contributing to the district. And certainly any new construction would not be contributing to the historic district. So modifications to the exterior of the building that can be seen from the public street would require review. So, and I'm going to reinforce this at the end of my presentation, but it's important to note that if an addition is done to the back of the property, cannot be seen from the public street, any interior modifications, they would not be regulated by this process at all. Because how the Secretary of Interior defines how a property contributes, it's from the public street. And the code before you also clarifies that does not include alleys. Because we've had questions, well, what about if I build a garage in my backyard and it can be seen by the alley? That would not be regulated by this, as long as it can't be seen from the front street. As I noted, interior improvements are not regulated by this. Ordinary maintenance, ordinary maintenance is not regulated by this. Any work that does not require a building permit would not be regulated by this. That's where the certificate of appropriateness that's defined within the ordinance is triggered, is through that building permit that comes before the city for review. And again, accessory buildings that cannot be seen from the street would not be regulated. With respect to contributing properties, demolition of the building, either full or impartial, would require review by the Historic Preservation Commission. Under the proposed draft ordinance, any decision by the commission, again, or staff can be appealed to the city council. So how would this impact non-contributing? Major modifications to the exterior of the buildings that can be seen from the street would require staff review. And again, it's the intent with the design guidelines that these would be much less restrictive because the non-contributing properties no longer contribute to the district. What's contemplated with this is an example that if somebody wanted to put a significant addition, for example, like a second story to a non-contributing property and all the other properties on that block are single story, that could potentially be regulated for non-contributing properties. But the more restrictive provisions that are contained within the code would not be. Demolition of buildings, full buildings, that are non-contributing would also be reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission under this proposed ordinance. Demolition of partial for non-contributing would be reviewed by staff, and structures built after 1945 would also be reviewed by staff. Again, city staff is also very sensitive to the building permit process, and so the intent with this draft decision matrix is to ensure that whatever proposed ordinance is adopted does not add to the length and delay for the issuance of building permits. With all of these considerations, whether it's by staff or by the Historic Preservation Commission, it would be reviewed by the city's historic preservation consultant. So when I refer to staff review, I'm referring to Northwind Resources, which the city has a 5-year contract and has their expertise to be able to evaluate compliance with the Secretary of Interior standards. The considerations by the commission would also include the recommendation by the historic preservation consultant. Some of the other elements of the proposed ordinance, we already talked about the decision matrix and either commission or staff approval, provides for the creation of new historic districts. So like the existing ordinance in place, this provides for the potential creation of new districts throughout the community and includes steps on how that can be initiated. It also provides maintenance standards for the preservation of historic structures within the historic district. And then also provides provisions on demolition and demolition relief. You will have seen in the proposed ordinance, it talks about if a building is deemed unsafe by our building official and needs to be demolished because of life safety concerns, it does require notification of the commission, but that can proceed. Also, applicants who have economic hardships and can demonstrate that they don't have the ability to maintain a property could seek approval of demolition from the Historic Preservation Commission. What this ordinance does not regulate, and I just wanted to reemphasize this, again, any work that doesn't require a building permit will not go through this process. Because again, that's the functional trigger of review by the city. Work that cannot be seen from the public street, any interior remodeling, and again, ordinary maintenance. I think one of the concerns that's been raised is if, a baseball goes through somebody's window and busts the window, do they have to get Historic Preservation Commission review in order to replace that? No, That's ordinary maintenance of that window. And it wouldn't require a building permit anyway. So next steps. This afternoon, tonight, is your consideration of the proposed ordinance and your recommendation on to the City Council. In your packet, in the section of the staff report that highlights options for a Planning Commission recommendation, you can recommend approval of Resolution 1221, which includes the findings for the recommendation. You can recommend denial of Resolution 1221, or if you have certain elements of the ordinance that you support or proposed changes you want to make, you can make your recommendation in support conditioned on those changes. After the public comment period and Planning Commission deliberation and a recommendation by the Planning Commission, the next steps in the process for this ordinance are a bill introduction before the City Council. When that bill is introduced before the City Council, no action is taken by the City Council, no deliberation, they just introduce the bill. And then within 30 days, the City Council would then deliberate and then vote on the proposed ordinance changes. And so with that, I will take staff questions.
All right. I'm just going to jump right in here and start. One thing that I don't see noted, but I think I heard reference to it earlier on, will the city provide either city or state funding, or will that be available to assist with costs that might be incurred by a homeowner trying to maintain their building in a historic, at an historic level?
So I think what's very important is the ability that the city now has with the contract with Northwind Resources to be able to have somebody with the expertise that can meet with property owners very early on in the process. One of the challenges with today's ordinance is that property owners hire a architect, hire a contractor, prepare plans, submit a building permit to the city. They've already have a vision in place without any guidance with respect to how to maintain a property's contributing status. And by the time it gets to the city and it gets to the Historic Preservation Committee, that is too far along in the process. And so with those resources now and the opportunity to consult with the historic preservation consultant very early on, that's one way the city can support property owners in their potential modifications to their home. Secondly, we have two grants that have been approved by the City Council specifically for historic preservation efforts. The first is a RDA grant for commercial properties where those commercial modifications can receive up to 50% reimbursement up to $100,000 for historic preservation efforts. Secondly, the City Council adopted a residential historic preservation grant up to $10,000 reimbursed for those improvements. Again, exterior improvements that would help to preserve the historic property.
Thank you. So as far as you know, did the writers of this ordinance that we're looking at today, did they compare it to other communities? I believe it mentioned something about Las Vegas, but were there any other communities, San Diego, other recognized historic communities that this might have been patterned after?
When the ad hoc committee first convened at their first meeting, one of the things they asked for was examples from elsewhere. And so staff provided them examples of other ordinances, including the SHPO model ordinance. SHPO refers to the Nevada State Historic Preservation Office, and they had prepared an example ordinance that communities could consider.
Chairman, I have a question for staff. Does this ordinance affect whether it's passed or denied any grants or anything else, or is that in place now?
Does it affect those grants?
Yes, so if it's passed, does it make it more grants available? Or it's the same because it's already in a historic district?
So under the current historic district designation, those grants are already in place. And so the guidelines have already been adopted by the city council, so they wouldn't be impacted by the ordinance. They just have to follow the guidelines.
Ms. Bonner?
I have a few questions. We were talking about the grant and changing the face of the property. What about accommodations for ADA?
So there are provisions within the commercial RDA grant that helps to provide for that. Another provision within the existing building code. The existing building code that was adopted by the city in 2020 provides accommodations for historic buildings and relief from those code provisions in certain circumstances to help preserve the historic buildings and address modern requirements.
So in short, if somebody needed wheelchair access later on their property, there would be no obstacle in doing that?
No.
You talked about obligations related to maintenance, and we know there's fines involved for not doing things. Is there any financial relief for the maintenance in terms of delays if they've applied for the grant, delaying the daily fees?
Certainly, as with any fine provision within our city codes, the city is always looking to work with property owners. You'll see that within the provisions there are several notices that are triggered before any fines would be issued to help work with those property owners to bring them into compliance. And certainly, if a property owner is applying for a grant to help address those issues, the city is not going to push forward with enforcement because that property owner is working to address those issues.
And what happens when somebody can't afford it, they don't qualify for the grant? What are the chances of somebody losing their home because of this designation and requirements under it?
Well, I guess that goes back to, is this home contributing or non-contributing? But I don't know how they would lose the home because our municipal code requirements and the civil fines that are being contemplated in here wouldn't have any impact on home ownership.
Okay? Those are my questions. Thank you.
Commissioner, one more question.
Go ahead.
Has any of the neighborhoods ever tried to create their own HOA that would restrict or limit on a voluntary basis?
I'm not aware of any initiatives to that.
Mr. Chair, I have a question for staff.
Yes, Ms. Crum?
Thank you, Michael, for the great presentation. I have a couple questions. Just out of curiosity, if a non-contributing property that was built between 1930 and 1945, it's non-contributing because it was modified, could it ever go back to contributing if the homeowner restored it to its original state, or once the modifications have been made and it's been changed, it's done?
In talking to our historic preservation consultant, Courtney Mooney, she says it's difficult to bring it back to contributing, but not impossible. So depending on what were the modifications, one of the ways that she's described how a property goes from a contributing to a non-contributing status is, has there been 3 major modifications, like an addition, replacement of the windows, and closing of the porch? You would need to address most of those, if not all, to bring it back to a contributing status. So certain properties could be brought back to contributing, others it would be too cost prohibitive to do so.
It's just case by case basis.
Mhm.
And then the other question I have is, in June of 2021, when there were the workshops, how many business owners and residents attended? And the ordinance that we are looking at today was presented to them at that time?
Approximately 50 people attended the combined meetings, and yes, a draft ordinance that has been since modified, but in largely the same form, was at that meeting.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Any other questions of staff? All right. Thank you very much. With that, we move on to the public comment period. And so those who would like to be heard on this matter, please step forward and state your name for the record. And again, just kind of as a point of order, 5-minute is time limit, and please do not direct comments at any individual commission member.
Oh, damn, I was gonna.
I know, I did that to protect myself.
Yes, good idea. Larry Turner. I have so many objections, I'm afraid I'm gonna wind up rambling. First of all, I think some of the read-in comments are a little suspect. One of them was from Rebecca Haig, who is my next-door neighbor, who sold her house about a year ago and moved to Italy. She had a very lengthy comment tonight about how in favor she is of this ordinance. She's in Italy. I own a home on Denver Street that is contributing. Whether it's true or not, I tell everyone it's the first house built in Boulder City. We love the house. We gutted that thing and did a complete remodel. The exterior is 100% original. I'm currently applying for permits to add a carport and a patio, which are kind of a modernistic look. I think it'll be a great complement to the historic building. You can view both of these from the front of the property. I also have a public street on the back of the property, so viewed from a public street, I'm not sure. In any event, you can see it, and I'm wondering if the committee doesn't like my idea, I'd much rather rely on my own design concept rather than having people I don't even know who don't own property up here telling me that they don't agree with it and that I can't do it. If I do something that other people don't like, it only hurts my property value. It doesn't hurt anybody else. And I think when it's done, it'll be aesthetically very pleasing. But I don't want to rely on these people to make that choice for me. It's my property. It should be my choice. We also, with one of my sons, just bought the ugliest building on Denver Street. It's one of the last ones that has no landscaping. It has nothing done in front. This is one but ugly building. Most of the other ugly homes on Denver Street have been remodeled. They've added patios. They've upgraded the windows, enlarged the windows. A lot of changes have been made to the structure, so they're non-contributing. I'm not sure if this one is contributing because it's still that ugly or not. My point is, our long-term range is to make this building as attractive as the other buildings on Denver Street, which have been sort of completely remodeled in the front because they needed to be. Just because a building is old doesn't mean it's desirable or, old isn't the only thing. It needs to be livable. You need to have windows that are functional or, are modern, they're effective. We've been before the Historic Committee many, many times. We've done a lot of remodels in this town. We own several buildings currently in the Historic District. No one can accuse us of trying to, in any way, degrade the history of these historic buildings. We love them. But I don't think I need this kind of oversight. I don't need this kind of infringement of my personal rights. It wasn't there when I bought. I don't think you should overlay this onto my property now. And I would just as soon be left alone. If there are people who want to be in this, knock yourself out. Just leave me alone. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Jennifer Sheldall, 718 Park Street. I just want to set the record straight. The letter from Rebecca Haig in Italy, where she's currently living, she is the owner of 718 Park Street. She was born there, lived her whole life there, still has the building, and she's the owner of the building, even though she's not in residence at the current time. Thank you.
Thank you.
I take it back.
Thank you for the clarification.
Fred Bachhuber. I moved into Boulder City in 1977. I am in a non-conforming house that was built in 1940, 1941, in that time frame, built by Senator and Governor of the state of Nevada, Mr. Scrogum. Scrogum, according to Elton Garrett, which he told me, was a cottage, a winter cottage that he built for his mistress and his Chinese cook. Now, I suppose that is historical, and I should do everything in my power to maintain that type of tradition in our house. I am representing not only myself, but also my wife. 2 speakers ago, the gentleman made some very strong arguments about it is my property, I can do any damn thing I want with my property. That's not our country. Boulder City is a microcosm of the troubles and tribulations that our country is going through at the present time. We are a country controlled by laws. We're a country controlled by zoning. We're a country controlled by ordinances. I may not like what Matt proposes tonight, but if it's a majority proposition, do I not have to live by that? I am very much in favor of any kind of a historical ordinance, and I especially thank Michael Mays for his presentation. We have to have some laws and ordinances and zoning which are for the betterment of the community. Now, there are lots of things that I would like to do with my house. I would like to paint it red. My neighbors would object to that. But there's nothing in an ordinance in Boulder City which prevents me from painting my house red. That's absolutely wrong. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous to have a 2-story house blocking the view of an individual who has a view of the lake, and there's nothing preventing that individual from a 2-story house. We have to have zoning within the city. We have to abide by laws. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, my name is Bryn Delormier. I just wanted to respond to a couple of things that were said in that presentation and a couple of things that were said up here and a couple of these comments. I think it's fair to want to build something like a carport, and I have seen those homes on Denver. I think I actually toured some of them when we were looking at homes here. that's reasonable. As far as painting your house red, per this ordinance, I think you can actually still do that. Correct me if I'm wrong. We met about paint colors. I was asking because for stucco, it actually makes sense to mix it in. So that's a big commitment. So I was trying to make sure I picked the right one. I don't think there's anything in the ordinance that actually states you can do that. And one of the public comments read was about painting your house purple and gold. Believe you can do that. And about the hoarders, we have a couple on our block. I don't think it prevents that. It's not about policing the community. It's about preserving the features on our houses that make them historic. So just to address that, they're two separate things. And as far as wanting to park a car, I think that's completely reasonable. And we're one of the ones that want to build an alley-facing garage. As far as I know from what I've read about our homes and the history, we didn't have driveways that extend the 122 feet that mine currently does. I want to put an alley-facing one and tear up our driveway and put some trees there so we have some shade on the south-facing side of our house. And I'm hoping I don't have to wait a year to do that, which we already have done. So I just wanted to say that. So, and I'm wondering, these people that, I've heard a lot of comments from people that I know don't live in the historic district, and in particular, I'm familiar with one who does, who's owned her home for the majority of time it's been on the NRHP. It's since been rated as non-contributing, so, and also it was asked if this has been, if other cities were studied, and I've lived in a number of cities. I've had homes on the NRHP before, sorry. And we've had historic preservation committees. Ours have been more grassroots. And ours worked to support the community by doing fundraisers to add things like historic street lamps and historic-looking park benches and features that gave residents something to design to rather than policing them. And people pretty much adhered to that. We'd occasionally get the house that had gone too far. I mean, my house, one house was built in 1830. And they can't all survive. So we did occasionally have, and they would design in kind, so it wasn't ridiculous. That was Northern Liberties in Philadelphia, which was once one of the 10 largest cities in this country in the early 1800s. But it worked well there, and we didn't have a lot of contention between neighbors that I'm seeing here, which is concerning. So that is something we want to avoid, or at least I want to avoid. So I think there has to be a better way to go about this. Like I said, a lot of my neighbors on my own block could not attend this. So I think they're going to have different ideas, but I think it would be a better idea to reach out to them and ask what would be acceptable to them rather than saying, you can do this, you must do this. A lot of the fines that were stated, those are a concern to me. I know what their houses look like. I know they couldn't get off work because they work insane hours. So I know it's not a possibility for them to even do some of this upkeep financially. And to the point about getting loans to do so, nobody wants to go into debt to do aesthetic upgrades when they're gonna have to be replacing sewer laterals at massive figures within probably the next 1 to 2 decades. So that's a concern for me, and I don't want my neighbors to have their properties degrade to a point where it affects the entire neighborhood's property values. So I think those were some other points I want to make. I'm sure I'll have a million, but those were some of them. Thanks for hearing me out. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Good evening, Commissioners. It's been a while since I've been in front of the Planning Commission. My name is Alan Goya. I live at 413 Utah Street, just up the street in the Historic District. And seems like I've been talking about, well, I've been involved in this, so I thought being a citizen, I should give my public comment and part of this. But had a general meeting with some of my neighbors and just see how they felt in general about it. And, you know, one of the things that you notice about the properties that are contributing in general, is that they're not contributing because of a city ordinance is because the residents valued their properties and have taken great effort to preserve their properties. And I think in general, there is that feeling in the historic district that this is important. And I come from a little bit different point of view. My point of view has always been, what is the story? And you know, Boulder City and Hoover Dam is one of the great stories. And I get amazed. I mean, I've been here, be 30 years in January, and it's just amazing the stories that I keep discovering and the significance of our city to the history of the United States. And I think for me, it's important that we preserve those items that tell this story. And one of the things that's unique about Boulder City, I think when you make your consideration on this ordinance, is that it is the devil's in the details, and it's those neighborhood guidelines, I think, that need to be explained to people. Because the homes, let's say, on Denver and Park Street are different, very different than the homes on the avenues, which were designed as temporary homes, as you know. Originally, it was all supposed to be raised, and up on the hill here were supposed to be the permanent homes. And so I think it's to look at these guidelines and specifically helping the guidelines, for example, on Cherry Street, I mean, on the avenues, you know, the tree streets and things. I mean, I think those, you know, all those residents there, anybody with a lawn is working hard to make their house perfect. And I think it's a mutual benefit for the whole community. Matter of fact, not only, you know, I know people from Henderson to go walk their dogs in our neighborhood because it's the best place to go walk their dogs, you know. And it's green and tree, and you can see the historic landscape there where, you know, the federal government used to take care of all our lawns and all our front lawns, and it was kind of an amazing area. But that's part of the history of our planned community, and I think we have to kind of value those things. And one of the things I think that when you go into neighborhood guidelines that we shouldn't forget is, and I know that because Blair Davenport of the Historic Preservation Committee kind of put this in my head, is the historic landscaping. And now in this age of the drought, the water shortage, and all those kind of things, it's, you know, we're kind of picked on a little bit in Boulder City because I hear we have the most grass per capita of any place in Clark County. But I think one of the things that we should remember, the thing that kind of got, you know, the whole historic preservation, this is with the Dennis McBrides and the Barbara and Paul Adams, kind of what motivated them. They always tell me, 20 years ago we met with Reclamation because they wanted to tear out the lawn over there. And that's the years when SHPO came in, the community came up and said, hey, this is a historic lawn. That was the first thing the city had, was the lawn. And the community would spend it was the only cool spot in the town. And, you know, I mean, one of the things I think we should be looking at is historic, landscape. I mean, I don't think we should have any excess lawn, but, you know, we're all about the grass here in Boulder City. And I think we should consider these things. But it's the neighborhood guidelines that I think are most important. But anyway, it's you know, congratulations, Michael, and your department, and Planning and Historic Preservation Committee and City Council. We don't want this to dead end, you know, we don't want what happened in 2007, we don't want to happen again. We don't want to get to this point and fail and have nothing. So now's the time, because there are other places we talk about, you know, the historic district, we kind of focus on the historic district, but our next area of development and growth, I think, is like the new Railroad Museum down here on Nevada Way. Now, there's an area that, you know, calls out for, you know, as another historic district. We need to inventory those buildings. They're the first Ford dealership in Southern Nevada. I see Burt Runyon has for sale right now, and that's right at Buchanan and Nevada Highway. I'm sorry. 5 minutes. But I think that we have to, you know, settle this ordinance thing, and we have to develop other districts, like maybe in the motel area or Bullock's Field. I mean, I think this is the last time I was with the Planning Commission, Bullock's Field, but Bullock's Field or the historic railroad area. But, you know, we should be doing something this town. And thank you all for your good work. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Rhonda Kaufman, and I live at 1309 New Mexico. My house was featured by North Wings of what not to do. I did not do the work on my property. I no longer contribute, but some of the verbiage in the ordinance disturbs me. Neglectful demolition with maintenance issues, cracked plaster, peeling paint on eaves and overhangs. These are things that can become money-making items for the city. It's going to cause inspectors to look for these things in the historic district, and that worries me for the contributing properties. When I bought my house, I bought it because it was in the historic district, and I paid a premium for it. And I paid for my plaque. And then I got a letter in the mail with no notification and saw my home on display. So I hope that that doesn't happen to other people. And I hope that they're protected in a reasonable way without misdemeanors and fines. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Robert Langevin. I live in the Tree Streets. I'm sorry? Hi, Robert Langevin. I live in the Tree Streets. My property would be considered contributing. I just would like to point out to the commission that I would really appreciate it if they would take a long, hard look at both the enforcement section and then also to exactly what they're empowering the Historic Commission with. There are some items in both of those sections that are of significant concern. Also, too, I know that a point was made to make the entire changes more palatable, that as long as it's not seen from the street, it would be okay. But there are properties all over the historic district that are on corners, and you can see pretty much every single side of the building and the outbuildings from the streets. So I think that should be noted as well. The other thing that is of particular concern in the enforcement section is that there are still members of the community and residents in the historic district that are recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as senior citizens, disabled members of the community, and veterans. All of these individuals, and myself included, could be anywhere from one bad day from having their entire circumstances irrevocably changed. I used to work in the convention industry, and thankfully I'm happy to report that it is rebounding, but I came to work one day and there was work, and the next day there was no work. So in the matter of a moment, someone's financial circumstances can completely change, and that also goes that also should be considered as far as our senior citizens, our veterans, and our disabled members of the community who also live in these districts, is that on any given day, their financial circumstances can be completely changed, and this enforcement policy that's dictated in this ordinance has real significant concerns as far as how that could affect these individuals. Also, too, it doesn't really state how these funds that are generated will be spent, whether there'll be any oversight for these funds. And then to bring up also the matter of the grant that is currently available for resident owners, there is a lot about that particular grant that makes it very difficult to, number one, use those funds for, and those funds are for reimbursement. So you have to spend the money first before you could actually apply to, and I know that that's standard policy for most grants. However, that's a significant expense that a homeowner, as well as the fines that could be levied against them, could be confronted with in order to kind of come in line with the current proposed policies. So I would just like to bring these items to attention, as well as the fact that there is a marked difference between contributing and non-contributing properties as far as these policies are concerned. And I think that's important to note as well, in that it allows for much more freedoms for individuals who are non-contributing versus individuals who are. So please just take a very long, hard look at the proposed policies, because they will have substantial ramifications for residents in a historic district. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to be heard on this matter? Please step forward.
I just want to say your audio system sucks.
So let me ask this, have you been having trouble hearing me? I couldn't understand that. All right. Would anyone else like to be heard on this agenda item at this time? All right. Let's move it to the virtual audience. So those who are listening in, please call to 702-589-9629, and we'll give them a moment to catch up with us. The delay. Well, hearing none. Hearing none. Let's bring it back to the audience here. Does anybody, this is kind of last call, does anybody have any comments they'd like to make before we bring this back to the Planning Commission?
My name is Milo Hurst, 54-534 Nevada Way. The only, I have pluses and minuses about the Historical Society, but the part that I would like to make sure, our town is changing. We're getting some young entrepreneurs that are coming downtown. And if this puts another roadblock and adds time to them getting their businesses open. So I'm not arguing for or against the historical thing. I think it needs to be addressed, though, that to get through the building department, the licensing department, and now a historical department, you're going to bankrupt young entrepreneurs before they even get a chance to bring great businesses to our town. You're not going to bankrupt an old fart like me, but some of the people that I'm leasing to, I hear from them, and one more roadblock in their way, they're not going to come here. And so the process is what I have that I'm concerned with more than I haven't read the ordinance, so I'm not gonna sit here and argue about the ordinance one way or the other. But I would like to say that I think that the process to get, when I came here, I came to the building department for help and got permits usually within a few days. And I'm telling you, it's just not happening now. So somehow that process needs to be looked at. As much as adding another layer, look at the whole process. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to make a comment on this subject? All right, hearing none, let's bring it back to the Planning Commission for discussion, deliberation, additional questions of staff as desired. Would anyone like to start?
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, Mr. De Teresa.
Yes, I've read this packet over 3 times. There's a lot to digest here, but my objections to this come down to my support of individuals' property rights. I see this as kind of an HOA in sheep's clothing. Yeah, I can't support it in its current form.
Was that it for your comment?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I just heard a phone ring, didn't know if that was a late comer to the public comment. Yeah, true. Nate, you were getting ready to make a comment?
My light. Holly, my light's not coming on. Maybe the light's broken. Can you hear me? All right. Light's broken. Miss City Attorney, when we pull, I've been selling real estate for 20 years. When we pull a preliminary title report, when the property goes into escrow, nowhere on that prelim does it say that the property is in a historic district, whereas any other historic districts in the valley, they do show up. What kind of legal notification do we need to give these homeowners in regards to that before we start doing something like this?
When it comes to zoning classifications, generally property owners are responsible for doing their own due diligence on what the zoning classifications of the property are and researching what they would need to do. As far as the title company and whether that shows up on their report, I don't know their process and whether that's something that they look at, whether if there's an ordinance, and if that's something that they do, I'd imagine if this was effective, that's something they would also include.
They have a generic line about possible CC&Rs and things like that at the bottom. I guess I just have an issue, me personally. I agree with a lot of the public comments about what was it, the strictness, the penalties, the turning this into kind of an HOA. I do agree with that on some level, but this historic district has, for the entirety of its district, has commanded premium property values without having to go through this. What I see potentially happening is we might end up creating 2 separate districts as far as property values go. The people that are contributing may get higher values, and the people that are non-contributing may end up suffering. And I don't know that it's necessarily fair to potentially have 57% of our district just lose their property values with something like this that we're enacting. I've been following this from day one, and if our esteemed mayor is still here, I just unequivocally like to say that you flat out lied when you said that I said about cabinet pulls or whatever it was. I've known this has been about exterior only, and this is the third time that you have lied about me. So I would appreciate it if you stopped.
All right, thank you. So, we're already getting ready.
I thought we were just gonna go down the line, but.
All right, go ahead, Ms. Crum.
Well, this is a very passionate subject, and I've been around for a long time. I've seen this come before the council before. I appreciate everybody's comments, and I really appreciate the work of the Historic Preservation Commission and the Ad Hoc Committee. I've read through the minutes. There's a lot of knowledge in that committee, particularly with one member. But I'll get into the ordinance specifically, but I think, when you talk about this failing again, you're never going to get a buy-in if you exclude the primary stakeholders, and those are the people that own businesses in the district and the people that own homes. The ad hoc committee was formed by people that do not own businesses, and they do not own homes in the historic district. You have to encourage people and incentivize them. And furthermore, the meeting was held during COVID when City Hall was closed. And so people will say, well, we did all this outreach and there's all these surveys. People cannot possibly focus on historic preservation. It's not a priority. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When you are a business owner and your business is being threatened because you are limited in who can come in and how you conduct business, you're not doing a survey online. When you are a parent who has to watch a kid in front of a computer for 8 hours, you're not concerned about historic preservation. This was done in a vacuum. And I know that because I know several owners in the district and several business owners that had no idea what this ordinance said. And so although I don't think the whole thing should be trashed and start over, I love what's happened so far with the plan. I think there are excellent points in here. I agree 100% with Commissioner Matt DeTeresa. Applying something like this to people who have already purchased their homes is not right. And historic preservation and private property rights are not mutually exclusive. You can have both, but I just firmly believe you'd get a lot farther if it was collaboration. But we came out of a 2-year pandemic, and people who are affected got punched in the throat with a very restrictive ordinance. There's room between what we have now and what this is, and there could be a nice compromise. People do live in that area on purpose. They're proud of their homes. It's beautiful there, and they have paid a premium price. I think, maybe our consultant, you could have buy-in if she met with these owners of the contributing properties and said, hey, would you like to join this? And then as people bought in, you'd get more and more buy-in. There were many comments made in the ad hoc committee that there should be multiple community meetings, and then because of COVID, oh, well, we can't do it because of COVID. Well, at that point in time, in my opinion, this restrictive ordinance shouldn't have come out of that. It should have been either paused or something else. But with respect to the ordinance itself, what I find really like the initiation of the process, I could get on board with a lot of this ordinance. I don't want to say that it's all, to strike the whole thing, but to initiate the process, it says the owner of the subject property a commission member or any council member may recommend a historic property designation in writing. Somebody else can nominate your property, and then you get a letter from the city, and then you have to appear in front of the council. That, to me, is absurd. I think the section 1127.5, to receive your certificate of appropriateness, I think that should be reworded to make more positive. And then I think the whole penalty portion should be deleted. I don't think we should be punishing homeowners. Like what, several of the people in public comment have mentioned, you don't know what's going on. And then if you have a hardship, if there's a financial hardship on some of these contributing properties, you have to appear before the board and explain your financial hardship. That is nobody's business. That is nobody's business. In the appeal process, I don't know. I agree with Matt. It should be voluntary. It should be incentivized. And with the way it's written, so restrictive, I could agree to a lot of it, but there are some areas that, as written, I could not support.
Thank you. I'd like to jump in here and really, I think we can see the way this is going. I think we've got a lot of people who have, up here, in fact, that have concerns about the way this is currently written. However, I think we're at a juncture in our community's history where we do need to take a very serious look at historic preservation. The current ordinance does very little to protect those resources. It certainly is at the discretion of the property owner. However, like everyone else here, I have property, and I would kind of hate to be just told what I can and can't do. I think where I'd like to go right now with the commission is, we certainly can vote A or nay, but as Ms. Crum said, and I couldn't agree more, we've got a framework here. It certainly has some positive elements to it. It has some things that I think we would generally agree should be in an ordinance. What I'd like to do is I'd ultimately like to provide to City Council at least some recommendations, if not even just bullet points, that would articulate what we do feel comfortable with. And those things that we don't feel comfortable with. Like so far I hear a lot of discussion about the fines. I've got to admit, the potential to levy $500 potentially a day fine is not real appealing to me. It doesn't mean that has to stay in there. We've been asked to provide a recommendation to City Council as to, and the recommendation can be certainly approve this as written. It can be rejected out of hand. But it can also be, let's provide useful information to City Council upon which they can build and move forward with. And I think that's doing our job. So I'd kind of like to hear what you
Well,
think.
I'll make a comment now. I'm totally against people taking away people's property rights, signing in, buying these homes. You didn't realize that. And by the way, I've lived in 3 homes now in the historic district on the Tree Streets, and then I owned one on the home that this couple owns. I owned at one point on Avenue 660F. As a custodian of one of these older properties, we always made an effort to make sure that we preserved it. And I think we should trust the people to do that. I don't think we need to police them to do it. I think people will do it on their own. These are very expensive properties, and I don't think people are gonna go out of their way to devalue them or take them out of character. So I think that, I'm not for taking any everybody's civil liberties way, and I think we should trust the people that own these to keep being custodians of these great properties. I mean, it's been 70 years and a lot of them haven't changed. I think, you know, some of them have changed out of necessity because they were falling down or needed to be fixed. But people that the home was taken care of and they can keep it that way, they did. So that's my comment on it.
I would also like to say, I think, you know, maybe a good compromise would be that this applied to the city and city buildings. I liked the comment, the public comment from one of the write-ins. You know, maybe start there to show people how this is going to work, and the city can lead by example. I wouldn't be opposed to that.
So what I'm going to take from that is kind of build on that and requirements as written, basically. You know, in other words, the mandatory nature would apply to city buildings, but I would also say state buildings and federal buildings. You know, the feds currently are under SHPOs. I don't think that's a reach, but public.
We
Good
can't.
point.
McCulloch
Good
v.
point.
Maryland.
Dang it, I wanted to overreach. Anyway, so. Yeah, there you go. So what I'd like to kind of hear, I'd like to spend a few minutes and just hear what it is in this that you do like. Because that's something that we can move forward to city council and actually assist them rather than just, once again, get this far and fail. I don't think failure is an option right now. I think we absolutely need some level of historic preservation. I think the community has come out strongly in favor of historic preservation, whether or not they live in a historic zone, of course. And at this point, it sounds like roughly 200 homes and businesses would be affected by this regulation, by this ordinance, as conforming. And the non-conforming, the ordinance is pretty soft. Did you have a comment, Matt?
Yes. Yes, I mean, everybody's in favor of historic preservation, including me, but I think this is overreach by the city government. I would prefer that we make a serious attempt to encourage people and incentivize people to maintain their historic properties, you know, with the Spanish arches and the original windows or replicas of the original windows and doorways. But the problem I have with this is beating people over the head with this. You know, we don't need, in my opinion, we don't need another committee to tell people what to do with their property in this town. And you're talking about, you know, penalties and punitive measures. I'm totally against that. So I don't know how we can make a recommendation to the city council, because for me to be in favor of recommending this to the city council, it would pretty much have to be gutted. Anyway, that's my opinion.
May I add on?
Yes, Ms.
Gutted
Bernard.
or made voluntary, because if we provided it as guidance for those that wanted to do it, they could take the best parts that fit their budget and their homes and their needs. I think we need to do something, but forcing it from a government perspective, I'm completely against. I think we can still encourage and do the right thing in terms of providing the guidance and make it more, something more of an incentive than a punishment. Or forcing people to do something they may not be able to afford to do.
Yeah, fair enough. I think we all agree that the penalties, we could certainly drop the penalty element of this. From what I'm hearing, a voluntary, I don't know if commitment is the right word. You know, another option would be to canvass the people who have historic, well, you know, canvass the people who are within the historic district. See and get voluntary, say, perhaps compliance with guidelines that are similar to these. Not going to say that they're going to be identical, because any kind of effort at outreach is going to yield changes, improvements, and that sort of thing that more closely match the will of the community. Did you have a comment you wanted to?
Mr. Chairman?
Oh, Ernie.
Yes, I am here.
Sorry.
No, I'm definitely here, and I've been definitely listening, and I guess I'd like to throw, a few of my thoughts or comments in. You know, everybody has said a lot of different things. I mean, obviously the work that has been done by the committees and everyone that has brought this to the point that it is right now definitely have done a great job. I think, and we started here with a lot of the commissioner comments addressing what are essentially some very key points that really say maybe there's some more work that has to be done. And I got to tell you, this is a pretty complex document the way it's written, because it's written like a very requirement-oriented ordinance, as ordinances are, but what we're dealing with is a little bit more of a guidance document. I think there are hard points, I think, that I would say are well put forward in the matrix, the certificate of appropriateness approval matrix. If you just focused on that, you can see that really all the key issues you want to control are really addressed there. Largely what we're hearing, I think, is, or I'm hearing, is process issues. One of the key ones being we're going to add a lot of time. Well, I know in the original, the original ordinance, it was like 45 days. I personally, while I think 45 is aggressive, I think a timeline should be set on it, because you can't keep it open-ended, and at the same token, you can't just let it linger. So you have to have what I would call a reasonable timeline to run a process, especially if you're going to add another commission in the approval process. So I think I'm coming down to, we've talked about fines, maybe they don't belong there. We've talked about voluntary involvement by owners, which kind of speaks to the issue of guidelines in terms of how people participate. But once you have selected you want to participate, then the ordinance kind of kicks in, and so I guess the only other thing, I think the key elements are in the ordinance, which I like. I just think there are other things that kind of need to be cleaned up. And I don't know that I have a good suggestion on how to do that, because it's almost like it needs another level of either review and or work. Those are my thoughts, at least at the moment.
Yeah, I would agree with Commissioner Biaski that what we're seeing here needs additional work. I think we've heard a number of public comments or comments from the public indicating that the outreach program was stymied pretty significantly by the COVID years, and as a result, people do not feel that their voices have been heard. I think we need to recommend to the City Council that we continue the process to develop the guidelines, to flesh them out a little bit more. So I've been kind of listing some of the things that I'm hearing from the commission. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, couple of things. I would recommend removing any instance of the certificate of the appropriateness process. I'd be in favor of
Nate, I couldn't quite hear. You said removing any what?
removing any instance or any mention of the certificate of appropriateness process. My concern is coming up having, I think if we do that one thing, it removes people having to come up to the commission to get approval for everything that they want to do. It keeps it voluntary, which was my next point, that the property owners in the historic district can voluntarily decide that they want to do these guidelines. If they want to do it, then maybe there's enough peer pressure that more people end up doing it. I'm okay with the delayed demo permits. Remove the enforcement that we've talked about, and then the requirement for the standards of preservation by the Secretary of the Interior. If you read through those, there's a PDF for the standards of preservation. It's got 8 items on it. After talking with contractors, that's a pretty hard list to stick with, especially with the availability of today's materials versus materials that were available in the 30s. So, anyway, those are my recommendations.
I'm not going to try and, I do like the ordinance. I like the, with respect to the purpose statements, the goals. I like the certificate of appropriateness. I think that's the crux of it and important, but I'm not going to try to sit here and go paragraph by paragraph. I don't think that's our jobs. And furthermore, I really think the people that have contributing properties should be directly involved. So although I can support many things in this ordinance, just as Commissioner DeTeresa stated, I wouldn't want to try to go through point by point and make the recommendations to council without stakeholders having their input. Without the primary stakeholders having input.
No, and I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is that we so I think it's pretty clear that the ordinance as written is not going to get recommended to council tonight. No. Is there any doubt about that? Okay. So what can we do that would actually provide some assistance to city council? That would also help the community with regard to historic preservation. Community certainly is behind it. So what kind of things? So I've got a bullet list here that I've been taking from what I'm hearing from everybody here on the dais. So voluntary grassroots. But one thing that I would like to see is that if a person voluntarily commits to following the guidelines, that basically the ordinance would kick in. Now, as far as the ordinance is concerned, I too think we need to think very seriously about the penalties. Whether we include them at all or reduce them significantly, take them out. I mean, frankly, it's voluntary compliance at that point. So I think the penalties would have to drop. Requirements to city buildings, that this ordinance would apply to city buildings, period. and incentivize compliance. So for instance, if you voluntarily choose to apply, to live to the ordinance as, as it ultimately becomes, and it won't be what we're seeing here tonight, I don't suspect. But, something almost as, we've got grants available, we've got loans available, but we also can do something that's more of a visual impact. Something, be it a plaque, whatever the case may be, that indicates you are participating in the historic preservation of the community. I think it is critical that no matter what we do, that we do need to have some kind of an approval process for demolition. We don't want these homes just completely removed from our landscape. I think a process timeline limitation, as has been suggested, I think that goes without saying. I don't think we want to add 2-3 months to a building permit process if we can avoid it. However, preservation does take time and effort. And I think if this becomes a voluntary effort, in other words, only the people who volunteer to participate are going to be living under the guidelines, I don't think they would see any issue with going through that process. So I would still like to put a process limitation, but I don't think removing the COA is the right answer. I think that is, as Ms. Crum says, kind of the crux of the whole ordinance. Those are just some of the things that I'm picking up. Now, are those things that could be recommended to City Council in the opinion of this group? And if not, please let me know what would.
I'm not so sure that it's our job, though, to rewrite this tonight. I would prefer that we vote it up or down, and if it turns out to be down, then I think that the responsibility goes back to the Historic Preservation Committee to make it not so punitive and come back with something else.
I agree.
And make it voluntary.
Well, the thing is, it's people, the chairman has talked about making it voluntary, which is fine, but we've also had speakers tonight talk about a need to expand the historic district. So now, there are going to be many people that aren't involved in this now that in the future will be, and I disagree with that too. It's like I said, a retroactive HOA. I completely disagree with that. Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, just a point of clarification. So how this ordinance was developed was through an ad hoc committee, 2 members of the Historic Preservation Committee, 2 members of the City Council. They prepared the recommendation that went to the City Council. City Council directed the text amendment process. So the next steps are for whatever recommendation comes out of the Planning Commission going on to the City Council, and the City Council decides whether to adopt the ordinance or not, or to redirect as the City Council determines. So just want to make that, it doesn't go back to the Historic Preservation Committee. That was through the ad hoc committee process.
Well, I think that
Mr.
makes
Chairman?
our job a little bit easier. Go ahead, Commissioner Piaski.
Yeah, I'm looking at this thing a little bit more, and the thing we have here is almost like a confusion or a mixture of what I would call policy setting requirements and what are then detailed implementation requirements. And maybe I'm struggling a little bit there because most ordinances are at the what I call the working requirement level of this is what you shall do, whatever. They don't necessarily, I don't believe, like this one gets so much into the process, and it's setting a very high level set of requirements. So maybe what I'm thinking of is when I look at this, you have good stuff about what's a historic district. How do you identify that? And then when you get into the specific buildings, also have, that's where the voluntary thing, I think, comes more into it. You can designate a district or an area, but then what you're really doing, you got to be careful about how you're defining what those individual buildings within it have to meet, or how they have, or the process by which they go through it. So I think that's because at one level it's talking policy of how this overall preservation, the historic districts, buildings are within the city, and how you actually then are going to go about having people do it, which gets into the more voluntary guidance-based requirements. Because it really is. It's up to the individuals as to how they want, or not how they want to, but I'll give them some freedoms, but keep the big issues in check. So, there's parts of this, I think Ms. Crum said it earlier, there's parts of this that are easily supportable, and then there's some problem areas. So what do we do? Do we reject it and then just say, hey, it needs to go back for further work, or just because I'm not sure we're here tonight to rewrite it. We're just like as has been said. So we got some work, I think. Someone does.
Thank you. So I've got a question of city staff, and I'm not sure to whom. So our options are to approve, recommend approval, recommend denial, or what I thought was recommend approval with these changes. Can we recommend denial with, say, recommendations to city council?
Yeah, yes, you can.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also, I think it's important to point out, too, that the entire minutes of this planning commission meeting will be shared with city council. So all the comments, regardless of the action taken by the planning commission, will be provided to the city council.
Very good. Well, I think I'd like to make,
I was going to ask if I could make a motion for denial.
yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Seconded?
Yeah, well, she's got to read it off.
Yeah, I've got to read it. I move to deny, I'm not sure how you say that, because both of them say approve in our notes. I move to approve Resolution 1222, which includes findings for a recommendation of denial of AM 22-359, and to include that the city council direct staff as needed to go back and reconsider the ordinance as written.
I second that.
All right, so commonly we have the opportunity to discuss. Is there any further discussion you'd like to hear?
Could you re-summarize that, what the motion is? It was difficult to understand it.
It was a motion for denial, to direct city, to recommend to city council to send it back to staff for rework, basically, in summary.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, does anyone have any comments? So, all in favor of the motion as described, in other words, a motion of denial?
Aye.
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 All opposed to the motion as described? All in favor?
Unanimous.
Give me a second, I'm looking for my agenda. Thank you. We do have a final public comment period available if anyone would like to be heard. And this, again, would be on this agenda item.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman, point of
Oh,
clarification, this is for any public comment, doesn't have to be related to the agenda.
Thank you. Oh my, that brought more people up. Ma'am, please step forward.
Hello, my name is Shauna Rudd, and I live at 308 Yuma Court. And I just have a clarification, sorry, can't you do things at once? Clarification question for Mr. Mays. So once it's denied, it's gonna go back to the council for their direction to take it back to the ad hoc committee and the Historic Preservation Committee? Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, we don't normally engage with, this is just public comment.
Sorry, I
sorry.
wasn't.
Okay,
But
so I guess-
I'm
I
happy to
guess-
talk to you
Ask-
afterwards.
No, I can,
Yeah.
I can hypothetically, ask the question as a comment.
And then we'll ask.
And my hope and/or recommendation would be that maybe the committees are comprised of business owners, homeowners, people that have a stake in this decision. Not somebody that's, I just would have a hard time taking recommendation from people that don't have a stakeholder in this decision. So I think that committee needs to be comprised of, again, stakeholders. They're like 2 homeowners, 2 business owners, and maybe a professional in a capacity that would have a good voice to add to the comments. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
5 minutes, can I have 5 more?
You may. But it'll cost you double.
That's fine. Thank you, I appreciate that. Name again is Fred Bachhuber. I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm 81 years old. I keep telling Michael, let's get moving on something, and I would like to see the results of it. But everyone behind me, aside of me and in front of me, is very naive about this whole issue. We talk about personal property rights. We talk about voluntary agreeing to do things. That ain't gonna work. You know it's not gonna work. I cannot build my house 1 foot next to the property line. Why not? Because there's a zoning ordinance which tells me that I can't. Now, I can complain about it. I can talk to the mayor or the city council or commission and say, I want my property rights. I want to build right up to 1 foot to that property line. I can't do it. Is there a penalty for me not doing that? Or to do it? Yeah, you're damn right there's a penalty. I can't do it. So let's not be naive. You are agreeing with historical preservation and having some constraints on it, or you are not. That's where we are right now, today. We're forgetting about historical preservation because we can't figure out how to deal with it. We can deal with it. And it's not by mutual agreement with everyone in the city. There's got to be some constraint on violating historical preservation. And I am naive, I will admit to that. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we close the final public comment period.
Chairman.
Oops. With that, we open it up to the virtual audience. Anyone listening, please call in to 702-589-9629. And again, because of the delay, we'll give them a moment.
Public comment, go ahead, please. Please state your name.
All right, this is Judy DeShane. I've watched the whole planning commission thing, and I've seen or heard a number of people say everything should be voluntary. Well, that's what we have now is voluntary, and voluntary caused us to lose half of the houses that were in compliance. So you're left with only half of the houses that are in compliance currently because the voluntary doesn't work. You do need an ordinance to enforce it. There is no way it's going to work on just a voluntary basis because that's what we've had for the last 20 years, and we've lost a lot of homes that otherwise would be. And nothing in this ordinance, if you are not compliant now, nothing in the ordinance makes you compliant. And if you want to see the effect of the voluntary, take a drive up Ash Street towards the end by where the water building is, and see what somebody did who did not want to follow it. And even though it was recommended that, it would put that home out of compliance totally, they went ahead and did it anyway because it was just getting a city permit. And it looks terrible, and you can see it from the far end of the block. So it does, and it affects the people that live across the street and anybody further down the block because of it being built that way. So what your neighbor does to a historical property does affect everybody else in the area. Thank you.
Hearing no more, I think it's time to close the public comment period. And with that, we bring this special meeting of the Planning Commission to a close.
Bye, Ernie.